The the topic is something called that the researchers call if only thinking. If only thinking. Now, here's why I bring this up. I mean, we all have our if onlys. Oh gosh, if if. We do this. But here's why I bring this one up today, because there is actually some new research out that they did on people that have a lot of depression and the relationship between if only thinking and depression. And that's kind of what caught my attention, because here's where it gets into, and they didn't go into the complicated bereavement aspects of this, although they did talk about that it's related to grief, and grief that doesn't get resolved as well, and people that stay stuck in it, which I guess is part of uncomplicated or complicated bereavement. But here's the thing. A lot of times when people go through something, sometimes they'll lose a loved one. And they will go on for, some people will go on for a long, long time with the if only. If only I had ... If only I had, and it might not be a death. It might be, somebody left. It might be a break. If only I had done this, then they wouldn't have left. If only I had been this way, then if only, or looking at a career, if only I had made that decision back then, if only, and it just goes through people's minds like a loop. I mean, it just goes, and all they do is sit and kind of think about, if only I'd done this differently, if only I hadn't have gone that day, if only I hadn't have, called them, if I had have called them, why didn't I take them, make them go to treatment, why didn't, whatever it is. And that is highly, highly related to depression. So I want to give you a couple of thoughts about this. Basically, the way that I think about this construct is that it, in part, is kind of part of a grief cycle. Now, when you think about the component, it is part of a grief cycle, I believe. If you think of the components of grief, what do we always hear? Well, first there's denial. We can't accept it. What? No. And that's the first thing we it comes out of our mouth when we hear bad news. No, because there's a we can't accept it. That's the denial part you've heard of. But then there's a protest, and that's what you hear is the anger part. There's always a protest, and then there's the bargaining piece of it, and that's the if only. It's the protest. What we're doing is we're working through the feeling of that should not happen. That should not happen. Well, guess what? You're right. That's why this is universal. I mean, we shouldn't do bad things, or bad things shouldn't happen, even the ones that we can't control, which is the kernel of a lot of this. That's right. We live in a world and a universe that has a bunch of crap in it that should not exist. That's absolutely 100% correct. Because as a person of faith, I will tell you that it wasn't designed this way. If you go to the story of the Bible, it was designed to be the way we all want it to be. Be loaded up with all this good stuff around us that we are put in control of ourselves to go do a bunch of great stuff, go rule and subdue this earth, go build things, go invent stuff, go invent cities, create nice parks with no germs and all sorts of stuff. And then the world went off kilter when we unplugged from the one who made it. And so now we live in this world that's, it's got a lot of great stuff, but it's all marred and scarred. So when you have this feeling, it should, or I should, or he should, or she should not have done that, you are right. Okay. And the first thing about this is just accepting that that's true, because you're not going to get over protest if you don't really give it a space to say it shouldn't be this way. That's true. And you got to give verbiage to that. You got to express those feelings. God expressed his feelings on this shouldn't be that way. That's what Jesus' death on the cross was. It was the big expression by God of his anger and his protest at death, at loss, at pain, at abuse, at gaslighting, at toxic behavior, at molestations, at cancer, at everything that shouldn't be the way it ought to be that we protest. Okay? But here's the issue. We got to go to the next phase. And the next phase is from it should not be this way, yielding to, but it is. And I have to accept that. And that's where a different kind of emotion begins to come in. The acceptance phase is when we have very, very distressing, awful feelings of sadness and pain, because it is a surrender into, but this is true. It is like this. Now, the good thing about the surrender protest feelings are not resolvable. We can stand there and protest and protest and protest until something changes. In these instances where something bad has already happened, it's not going to change. So moving into acceptance is to align ourselves, not that we like it, it's not what acceptance means, but we're aligning ourselves with the reality that has happened. And that leads to grief. That leads to grief. So I want you to think about the degree that if only is working in your brain. And we're going to go into a couple of things you can do about it. But basically, there's a couple of kinds of this thinking the researchers talk about. One of them is if you see yourself as the cause. You know, if only I had picked him up from school that day, then they, wouldn't have gotten into the fight with that kid. Or if only I had made him go have that checkup. Or if only I had acted differently in the relationship, whatever. In these things that you cannot control, but you see yourself in some way as having more control that is in reality, that's a group where we see high depression and high stuck in grief and distress. If only I had acted differently, then this wouldn't have happened. Now, some of that is in things that were under our control, okay? But I'm talking about the ones that a lot of them that weren't are also what is difficult for people. So when, some of that's true, right? In terms of, especially if it's something we could have done differently. So there's a good part of this. The good part of this is when we look back, if I had done this differently, then if it's used to not ruminate and beat yourself up. But if two things are true, one is this is a context or a situation or an occurrence that I could possibly face again, then that thinking is actually called learning. Well, if I had done this, that wouldn't have happened. So when this occurs again, I'm not going to do that. And that's learning. That's what life is about. See, that's a good aspect of if only. But if it's if only to punish yourself or fantasize or stay in then it could have been differently, that's a resistance to acceptance. So acceptance is basically what's behind the good move of all of this. Now, if you can look back and learn, see, that's positive forward thinking. Yeah, I won't do that again. If only I'd done that, then this would have happened. Gosh, I learned my lesson. I won't do it again. That's called repentance. That's a very good thing. So use it not to punish yourself. Now, here's the other thing. If it's not going to happen again, another context where you're not going to be in that circumstance again, then you have to stop the rumination and you have to accept it, and you've got to move on through forgiveness and grief and whatever feelings are involved in that. That's what forgiveness and grief are, our keys to surrendering and letting go of the past. If it's something that we did, we need forgiveness. You have to quote, as you've heard the phrase, forgive yourself. That's kind of an acceptance of it. So if it's not going to help, it's got to stop, because it is going to be tied to depression. So you got to turn that loop off in your head, that movie that keeps playing over and over and over. And what there's a particular school uh, of therapy that has you. It's called ACT. I think it's acceptance and choose. You know what it is you accept what's happening, and you have to accept the distressing feelings in that, but then you make new choices to engage according to your values and move forward. That's also a good treatment for a lot of anxiety. So I want you to think about this tendency. Do you live in if onlys in the past? Now, here's another problem with your if onlys. What's mixed up in there is part of just our, as theologians would call it, our sin nature. Yeah, I'm one of these people that believes in that we're not all good. We have another part living in us, a stream. What is the sin nature? Well, if you guys aren't familiar with yours, then you need an alarm clock. Actually, you don't. You can probably see it in your dreams. But our sin nature, in the way that I think about it as a psychologist, even theologically, what is the sin nature? It was the wish to be God. That's what the story, that great symbolic move that they made. It wasn't about an apple. It was about the wish to be like the Most High. What did Satan say? He said, God knows if you eat of this tree, then you'll be like him. Well, where in the world did they get that? Well, they got it from Lucifer, who eons before had tried to do that in the heavenlies. He tried to ascend to the seat of God, the wish to be God. God kicked his butt out, and about a third of the rest of the beings up there. But what is the wish to be God? Well, think about this in your if onlys. God is omniscient. He knows everything. We don't. But don't we act like we do when we blame ourselves? Gosh, if only I had them done. Well, you didn't. You couldn't have known. Yeah, but I should have known. No, how? You're not omniscient. See, our fallenness makes us begin to think that we should have known better. How would you have known? You should have known he was going to do that. You should have. No, your omniscience is not true. Or how about this? Omnipotence. We could control things. See, we fantasize we could have controlled that person or that outcome. So some of this is and like all of surrender, it's a humbling process as well. Now, I'm not saying, humble in sin nature and all that to, say you're bad for feeling this way. I'm just saying that that's mixed up in all of our faculties. So we got to give up the omniscience and confess, you know what, except you could not have known that. You could not have prevented that. You're not omnipresent. You could not have been everywhere. So if you're caught up in a lot of these if onlys, I want you to think about that, because it's painful, guys. It's really painful. And if you can look back and learn from something that's experienced, and you can trade that in for a new map of the future, and you can also use it to teach others. We can teach others from our mistakes. That's a positive use of these things that we regret. But if you're using it, or I shouldn't say using it, if you're stuck in it to your detriment, where you're feeling bad and awful and guilty, let's get into the let's just accept what is and let's grieve it, but don't forget the future.